70 years ago, in 1940, the RAF and the Luftwaffe were locked in a deadly battle. The men Churchill called the Few risked all to save Britain from German invasion.
The pilots had to be so young that they had no conception of their own mortality. The ideal pilot is a teenager.
The battle lasted for over 3 months and was fought over one of the most densely populated areas in Europe. All that stood between Britain and Nazi occupation was just 20 miles of the English Channel, the fighter squadrons of the RAF, and the determination of the British public to remain free. It was a battle that in total took down nearly 3,000 aircraft, killing almost 4,000 aircrew. And by the time it was over, 30,000 civilians had lost their lives. High above, both sides flew photo air reconnaissance missions. But incredibly, the Nazis misinterpreted their photographs, missing vital clues that would have won them the battle. Until recently, these photographs had been lost or forgotten. Now, 70 years on, this is the untold story of those lost photographs. Images that give us a unique view of the Battle of Britain and how it put a nation to the ultimate test. July the 6th, 1940, Berlin. Hitler returns to the German capital in triumph. In the last 9 months, his armies have conquered Poland, Norway, Holland, Belgium, and France. The victories were swift and stunning. The Nazi war machine had sheared a devastating swathe through Europe. But there's just one thorn in Hitler's side. A hostile island across the Channel, only 20 miles from occupied France, Great Britain. Hitler had never seen Britain as an enemy, but 2 weeks later, he issues Führer Directive number 16.
As England, in spite of her hopeless military situation, still shows no sign of willingness to come to terms, I have decided to prepare and, if necessary, to carry out a landing operation against her.
Orders go out to his chiefs of staff. Formulate an invasion strategy. All his victories so far had not just been triumphs for the German army. The Luftwaffe flying in close contact with a driving force behind the devastation. In France alone, 380 Luftwaffe dive bombers provided close air support to the advancing German troops, often reacting within minutes of a radio call.
They had almost complete control of the air and were able to use the Stuka dive bomber almost as a piece of precision artillery, moving ahead of the tanks to destroy Allied strongpoints as they went.
But over the skies of France, the Luftwaffe got its first taste of the Royal Air Force. As the battle intensified during May and June, hundreds of British Hurricanes were sent to France to stem the flood of German forces.
We were sent to Belgium on the 10th of May and only lasted the day there. Germans were coming through fairly fast. And we operated for a day from this little Belgian airfield. Absolute chaos. Nobody knew what was really happening.
Amidst all this chaos, and with no permanent airfields, British fighter losses were high. During May and June alone, just under 500 aircraft were destroyed and 284 pilots killed. After chasing the British Army from Dunkirk, the Germans now stared across the English Channel at their last remaining enemy. Just 20 miles separated the Germans from total domination of Europe. With all its European allies conquered, Britain stood alone. But there's one thing the Germans did not count on: the will of Winston Churchill, the British forces and citizens who would never give up.
Great Britain felt they were about to be invaded. And after the most technologically advanced and militarily powerful nation in Europe, France, goes down in front of the Germans, Great Britain could not feel safe from an immediate invasion.
In June of 1940, German reconnaissance planes photographed southern England, producing a complete aerial photo map. All of Britain's vital airfields, defense systems, and arms factories were recorded. Today, placed over a 3D contour map, these photos, lost in archives for over 60 years, give us an unprecedented bird's-eye view of the battlefield. But Britain was not totally defenseless. It had been preparing for this moment for over 4 years. In 1938, a series of radar stations were constructed around the coast of southern England. Called the Chain Home System, they formed a shield that could detect approaching enemy aircraft. But there was a problem. The primitive radar only worked over the sea, and not under 1,000 feet. So a second line of defense was formed by a web of 1,000 observation posts, designed to spot planes that got through the radar net. But they only worked if the skies were clear. By June 1940, Britain had slightly fewer than 1,800 anti-aircraft guns to protect the entire country. But the spearhead of British defense were the 18 fighter airfields in the south. From there, Britain's modern fighters, the Hurricane and the new Spitfire, would take off to attack enemy aircraft or an invasion fleet.
Now, in air warfare, height and surprise trump numbers every time. And because the British knew where the Germans were and where they were going to be, they almost invariably had height and surprise on their side.
However, Hitler was holding the ace card and didn't realize it. His reconnaissance team had photographed Britain's radar system, but instead of analyzing the pictures, Hitler's generals were squabbling over who would invade first and bring Britain to its knees. July 1940. Hitler's forces had triumphed in an extraordinary show of power. Much of Europe now echoed to the sound of the Nazi jackboot. Only Britain held out, an island separated from the coast of Europe by a mere 20 miles at its narrowest point. After the lightning defeat of Europe, Hitler's army, navy, and air force chiefs were supremely confident that they could take Britain. But precious weeks were wasted while Hitler waited to come to a decision. This delay enabled Britain's factories to go into overdrive and to start churning out the vital fighter aircraft that it so desperately needed.
Fighter production rose steadily from May through to July, with factories putting in an all-out effort, whilst German factories, on the other hand, continued to work much as they had done in peacetime on single shifts and so on. And that disparity in the replacement rate was to become crucial in the battle of attrition that was to follow over the following month.
With Hitler still undecided, Luftwaffe chief Hermann Göring finally persuaded him to let his aircraft handle the job. He proudly boasted that they would destroy the RAF in 4 weeks and give the Germans air supremacy. Then the army could invade across the Channel. To back up his promise, the Luftwaffe had bases stretching across occupied Europe. By July the 1st, 1,400 bombers, 300 dive bombers, 800 single-engine fighters and 240 twin-engine fighters were ready to go into action. Against this massive force, the RAF was severely outnumbered, with just 660 Hurricanes and Spitfires. Finally, Hitler gave Goering the green light to attack the RAF. The Luftwaffe had overwhelmed the Polish, French and Belgian air forces with ease. The RAF should be a walk in the park. But Goering's Luftwaffe was about to make a series of catastrophic blunders. Using aerial photographs, the Germans rightly calculated that Britain's fighters were hopelessly outnumbered by the Luftwaffe. But they missed vital clues. Factories building large numbers of fighter planes to replace those lost to enemy action.
The Germans had sent a spy over to the UK, who was codenamed Ostro, to find out what our production figures were. Now, it turned out that Ostro was a double agent, so he told them that the Brits were also producing about 200 a month, which seemed very plausible, so they left it at that.
The Luftwaffe had never been up against organized squadrons of brilliantly effective new fighters. The Hurricane and the Spitfire were two of the most technologically advanced aircraft in the world.
The Spitfire, you wanted to turn, you thought about it and it turned. It was a dream. You strapped the Spitfire on your back and flew. A Hurricane you clambered into and it was a tool, a working man's tool.
But the most disastrous mistake the Germans made was not to find out how the RAF defense system worked.
In the early days of the Second World War, the Germans did not understand what a powerful weapon radar was. If the Germans had understood just how clear a picture of the air war the RAF could get from radar, the Germans would have focused on destroying every chain home station in England.
Everything was there on the photos in front of them, but the Germans failed to understand what they were looking at. Look at this photo taken on the morning of July the 8th. It clearly identifies the radar towers, their position given away by shadows on the ground. On July the 10th, 1940, Phase 1 of the Battle of Britain began. The target, British shipping in the English Channel. Goering's plan is remarkably simple. By attacking shipping and ports, they will test the British air defences and lure the RAF fighters into battle. When they have destroyed the fighters in the air, they will be able to attack mainland targets with ease. The Germans led their attack with the infamous Ju-87, the Stuka dive bomber. Throughout the Nazi blitzkrieg of mainland Europe, the Stuka's screaming sirens sent a shiver of fear into enemy troops and civilians. Able to deliver bombs with pinpoint accuracy, it seemed an obvious choice to attack British shipping. But on July the 10th, Goering was in for a shock. During the early afternoon, a formation of 60 Stukas and 75 bombers with 200 fighters for protection attacked a convoy in the English Channel. The RAF scrambled their fighters and 30 Spitfires attacked the Germans. But instead of going for the fighter escorts, they concentrated on the slower Stukas. They took the full force of the Spitfire's cannons.
I knocked one down, and of course they were bombing hell out of our poor blokes there. And of course they only had one pop gun facing backwards, and I think about one facing forwards, and they were too busy diving. They were the easiest aeroplane the Germans had, if you got behind them. And they weren't in with much of a chance, really. Serves them right.
Over 20 aircraft were damaged or destroyed, with the loss of 23 aircrew. From that day onwards, the Germans called their Stukas the Flying Coffins. For both sides, it was a time of huge loss. By the middle of August, the RAF had shot down 172 German aircraft, damaging another 79. But the Luftwaffe had inflicted a heavy blow on the British by destroying 115 fighters and badly damaging 106.
At that rate of attrition, neither the Germans nor the British will be able to keep on fighting for very long.
But far more serious for both sides was the loss of trained pilots and aircrew. The Germans lost 153 with 45 wounded. The British, 89 men dead and 28 wounded. For the men in the front line of action, these losses had to be taken in their stride.
I don't know that I made many friends because we were losing people left, right and center. And I knew then that it was only going to be a question of time before it was my turn.
With casualties reaching alarming rates, Goering ordered a change of strategy to stop bombing the shipping and to attack and destroy the RAF fighters either on the ground or in the air. To change tactics in the middle of a battle was a huge gamble for the Luftwaffe, but it was one that they hoped would smash the RAF and leave Britain begging for surrender. August the 1st, 1940. 3 weeks later, the Battle of Britain was still raging over the English Channel. Luftwaffe chief Hermann Goering had promised Adolf Hitler that his mighty air force would obliterate Britain's RAF within a month. But the RAF was hanging on, still fighting as fiercely as ever. Hitler was growing impatient with this delay and told his military chiefs that he wanted the invasion of Britain to begin on September the 15th. As a last warning to Britain to sign a peace treaty, the Luftwaffe dropped thousands of leaflets calling for the British public to see reason. The British media had a field day, filming the public threading string through the leaflets and hanging them on toilet walls.
The British might have been prepared to see reason had he not also tried to use bully boy tactics. I think it's generally true of most human beings that when they're attacked, they tend not to want to talk to the people attacking them, but to hit them back.
On August the 6th, and much to the relief of his hard-pressed Luftwaffe, Goering and his military advisors came up with a new tactic to speed up the battle. They planned to stop bombing British shipping and to pummel the RAF fighters and their air bases. Goering's decision to change his plan of attack was because German intelligence officers had carefully studied their most recent reconnaissance photos of air bases in Britain and calculated that the RAF was down to its last 450 fighters. Once again, they got it wrong, as this aerial photo of RAF North Weald shows. Most of its fighter force is not at the main base. It is hidden in a carefully camouflaged satellite base a few miles away. The RAF camouflaged their main air bases with black sand, spreading it across the airfields so as to look like hedgerows from the sky. Because of these camouflage tricks, German intelligence was unaware that the British had 750 fighters ready to go into action at a moment's notice. They were also unaware that its factories were turning out nearly 400 new aircraft a month. But Goering believed his intelligence experts and boasted to Hitler that the RAF would now be destroyed in just 4 days. He declared August the 13th Adlertag, or Eagle Day, to launch the operation to crush the RAF. At 6:30 a.m. on August the 12th, the day before Eagle Day, Goering unleashed his Luftwaffe. German intelligence now knew about the radar towers. In 6 raids, squadrons of Stukas and Me-110s swept down on the radar stations dotted around the British shoreline. Very little damage was done, and incredibly, the Germans hardly ever attacked them again. German intelligence assumed they must be some sort of civilian aircraft landing system and decided that Britain had no operational radar. On this aerial photograph, taken of Bawdsley Manor radar station on the east coast of England, The towers are clearly marked by a German intelligence expert as being no military target. This mistake was to prove costly for the Nazis.
They ignored the most powerful device in the Royal Air Force's arsenal, and that enables the RAF to win. Ignoring radar was a war-losing move from a German point of view.
During the battle, British radar was at the forefront of a complex and sophisticated front line of defense. The British knew that speed was vital in getting their information to fighter command. A fighter plane needed 13 minutes from the order to scramble to reach its operational height. But a German bomber could cross the English Channel in only 5 minutes. This meant that with the 20 minutes warning radar could give, there was almost no room for error.
I reckon we used to get 12 aircraft into the sky within certainly about 4 minutes. And then you were climbing like mad to get to your height in time. And frequently you found you didn't make it. The German bomber stream was higher than you were, and fighter escort sitting higher still on top.
On the eve of Eagle Day, Goering sent a chilling message to his pilots.
Within a short period, you will wipe the British Air Force from the sky.
For the members of the elite Luftwaffe, it was the final countdown to 0 hour. Soon they would unleash the largest air offensive yet against the RAF. During August 1940, the Luftwaffe stepped up their attacks against the RAF in a bid to gain control of the skies before they could begin their invasion of Britain. Their targets were based on the aerial reconnaissance photos of southern England. But major mistakes were made, and attacks were never pressed home against the British radar stations. The Luftwaffe repeatedly misidentified the airfields and consistently underestimated the amount of fighters available to the RAF. Goering's long-awaited day to destroy British air bases got off to a bad start. Called Eagle Day by the Germans, it was dogged by bad weather and delayed until 2 p.m. However, some bomber groups were not informed of the change of plan and had already taken off. Goering's planned massive attack on Britain was already going seriously wrong, but it was to be a day of classic blunders by both sides. At 4:50 a.m., British radar picked up a formation of 55 German bombers heading towards the Channel. Because of radio problems, they could not be recalled, so a fighter pilot in an Me-109 performed a series of acrobatics in front of them to try and turn them back. They thought he was showing off and continued on. At 5:50 a.m., and unaware of the change of plan, a second wave of 88 Stukas, escorted by 60 Me-110s and 173 Me-109s, headed for the British coast. Due to the heavy cloud, the RAF radar and plotters misread the exact amount of enemy aircraft approaching them. Also, because the cloud was low, the Observer Corps, thinking it was a small raid, gave the wrong bearings and directions of the bombers. 5 RAF squadrons were scrambled, but because of bad intelligence, only one intercepted the enemy. Throughout the morning, the bad weather continued, but the Luftwaffe pressed home their attacks, targeting air bases and luring the fighters into the air.
The next minute, all hell broke loose. 2 bombs went through the roof of this hangar. If they just go through and hit the floor, they explode in and everything goes outwards. But this one must have gone through and hit the hangar door. They weighed 80 ton. And it lifted it and threw it forward, and a crowd of people running past were under it. We ran down to see if we could do any good, but we couldn't. I mean, there were arms and legs sticking out, but that's as far as we could get.
At 2 p.m., the weather improved, and Goering could unleash his formations of aircraft against Britain. In the first wave, there were over 100 bombers, protected by Me-109 fighters. By 2:54 p.m., they crossed into British airspace. The radar stations and plotting rooms were on red alert as they struggled to keep up with the waves of German aircraft. Fighter Command launched squadron after squadron at the Luftwaffe formations in an attempt to halt the onslaught. Throughout the long day, crews were constantly at red alert, waiting for their turn to be scrambled to action. For some, the waiting was worse than the fighting.
Waiting to take off was the worst part. I'd almost be sooner being shot at than a 109 than waiting to take off, because I found it terribly difficult to relax. Tried to read. Mostly you tried to sleep.
As the fighting intensified, the ground below became littered with twisted metal as one aircraft after the other was shot out of the sky. But many bombers did manage to get through. One German formation headed for a particular target, the RAF base at Eastchurch. German intelligence experts reported that aerial photo reconnaissance had discovered Spitfire squadrons based there. At 7 p.m., the area became a kill zone. Direct hits from the Luftwaffe's Dornier 17s dropped more than 100 high-explosive bombs on the aircraft hangars and buildings. 16 personnel were killed and 48 seriously wounded. Although 5 RAF aircraft were destroyed, they were old fighter bombers, not Spitfires. The German intelligence had got it wrong again. They had attacked the wrong airfield. Eastchurch was an airbase to protect shipping, not a frontline fighter base. Incredibly, over the following days, the Luftwaffe returned 6 times to bomb Eastchurch. It was to be a familiar mistake they would make throughout the battle. By day's end, the Luftwaffe had flown nearly 1,500 sorties, and the RAF almost 700. The RAF lost 84 fighters, the Luftwaffe 47 aircraft. While the British called it a miracle they had survived, Goering withdrew to his hunting lodge in East Prussia and called senior Luftwaffe commanders to join him. As they gorged on wine and wild boar, they celebrated their progress. They were convinced that if they continued to pound the fighters and air bases like this, then the RAF would soon be finished. Because of the success of Eagle Day, Goering decided to increase the attacks and launch the largest air offensive of the war. As British civilians watched from below, the sky was a stage where some of the most deadly and vicious dogfights in history were played out. The RAF were losing the Battle of Britain, leaving the Germans open to bomb frontline fighter bases. Those in the firing line were Biggin Hill, south of London; Debden, east of London; and Kenley in the south of England. Layered over a 3D map, these photos, lost in archives for over 60 years, now give us an unprecedented bird's-eye view of the battlefield. The constant pounding by the Luftwaffe on the air bases was slowly wearing down the RAF.
There was one period when the short-term trend was such that if it carried on at that rate, they were actually going to start losing more pilots than they were bringing into the squadrons.
But one day, August the 18th, would be forever known as the hardest day. The Luftwaffe had over 1,000 bombers and 745 fighters. The RAF, only 630 fighters. At midday, on a fine but hazy Sunday, radar reported a build-up of aircraft over Calais. It grew into the largest plot they had ever seen. 108 German bombers were heading for the RAF fighter base at Kenley, escorted by 483 fighters. Immediately, the squadrons were launched to go into battle. As the minutes ticked by, the plotting rooms watched as the raid markers moved relentlessly towards the target. From the ground, civilians looked up to see the dogfights high above them. Like spectators at a gladiator arena, they witnessed the life and death struggle as bombers and fighters left long white vapor trails crisscrossing a blue summer sky. These dogfights were some of the fiercest in world history. Fought at anything from 30,000 feet to ground zero, these one-on-one battles were the ultimate test of man and machine, where only the winner survived.
The whole key to fighting in the dogfight was if you flew in a straight line for more than 15 seconds, you'd have had it. So you had to keep turning to prevent someone getting behind you.
To survive, you had to load the dice in your favor. Height is vital. If you could dive down on your opponent, you had him at your mercy.
You'd hope to get on their tail and follow them, and they'd be taking evasive maneuvers to try and shake you off their tail. And you managed to get a shot at them and knock them out of the sky. That was it.
With only 12 seconds of ammunition on board, pilots had to get in close to be sure of a hit. But even then, at closing speeds of over 600 miles per hour, the fight was over almost before it began.
Most things were over in a few seconds, and then the sky was empty again.
With the battle stretching over miles of sky, the experienced pilots tried to attack with the sun behind them. Less experienced pilots made the mistake of using clouds as cover.
Now, an odd property of clouds is when you're sitting above a cloud looking down into it, you can see an airplane climbing up out of the cloud for the last 500 feet of its climb before it comes out of it. But if you're the one in cloud, you can't see a blind thing until you're totally clear of the cloud.
All day long, more and more German bombers attacked the RAF bases around southern England. Every time they were spotted on radar, the RAF was there to drive them back. By day's end, the Luftwaffe had lost 69 aircraft and 31 badly damaged. With their huge armada of aircraft, they could just about afford these losses. The RAF was also suffering heavily. They had lost 63 fighters, with another 62 damaged. They could barely afford to lose the aircraft. They certainly could not afford to lose the pilots. At that rate of attrition, the RAF would cease to exist in a few weeks. But for Britain, it was about to get worse. On a routine scouting mission, RAF reconnaissance aircraft took a series of photographs over the Dutch, Belgian, and French coasts. Back at headquarters, the photographs were developed. What they revealed sent a chill through the British High Command. The images showed that huge numbers of landing barges were being assembled in the channel ports of northern France and Holland. These were the vessels intended to carry 250,000 battle-hardened troops to land on the British coast, to invade a nation whose army had been almost totally destroyed.
Every day you could see more and more of these barges being converted to go across the channel. German guns based in Calais were able to land shells on Dover. The Luftwaffe had taken over the English Channel, so it really did feel that things were hanging on a thread.
Only one thing stood between the might of the German army and certain victory: the young pilots of the RAF. Churchill called them the few. But by day 59 of the Battle of Britain, the RAF was on its knees. Late on the afternoon of September the 7th, RAF radar and plotting rooms picked up signals of the biggest attack yet. More than 1,000 planes were identified crossing the channel, filling up 800 square miles of airspace. The Battle of Britain was now entering an even more violent phase. Throughout the long, hot summer of 1940, British and German aircraft had been locked in a battle to the death. Both sides were suffering huge losses, but on a fateful day in September, the Germans had a change of plan. They called it Loge, the god of fire. At 3:30 p.m. on the afternoon of Saturday, September the 7th, the RAF radar stations picked up evidence of the biggest raid yet heading across the channel. The RAF was on its knees, but thinking the Luftwaffe would again attack its air bases, scrambled its squadrons to await the onslaught. But the German bombers flew on over the channel, over the airfields of southern England, across the hills of Kent, over the suburbs of southeast London. Their target was not the RAF airfields, but the docks of London. German photo reconnaissance had identified the vital shipping port and petrol refineries on the east side of the British capital.
Hermann Göring is going to stop trying to attack British combat power, and Hermann Göring is going to try to break the British will to fight by breaking London.
It was 4 p.m. on a warm, relaxing afternoon in London. Suddenly, people heard a dull roar in the distance. The sound grew louder as 150 aircraft suddenly appeared out of nowhere and attacked the docks with incendiary bombs. The fire services were at full stretch as over 1.5 million tons of timber exploded in massive fireballs. As wave after wave of bombers attacked the docks, everything on the ground below was pulverized.
I was actually underneath that raid on the docks because we didn't have time to get to altitude. And I was just underneath. I had to go out of the way because I could see the bombs dropping. And I saw the whole docks explode. It was quite a horrifying sight.
At 6:30 p.m., the all clear sounded, but the fires were now out of control, with 9 miles of riverfront ablaze. At 8 o'clock, the bombers returned in a continuous stream until 4:30 the following morning. Entire areas of the city were burnt to the ground, and the flames could be seen for miles. Those hospitals that had survived the bombing were pushed to the limit. Throughout the attack, doctors and nurses bravely carried on as the injured were brought in for attention. 430 civilians had been killed and another 1,600 seriously injured. Instead of it being a battle of the few, it had become the battle of the many. For 2 more weeks, wave after wave of Luftwaffe bombers attacked the city of London by day and increasingly by night. While the Luftwaffe turned its attention away from bombing air bases to bombing London, the RAF desperately used this time to build up its forces for the final showdown. On Sunday the 15th of September, the Battle of Britain was about to reach its climax. Poring over their latest aerial reconnaissance, German intelligence indicated that the RAF were down to their last planes. Some sources put it as low as just 50 fighters. Again, the intelligence units got it wrong. The RAF had 630 Spitfires and Hurricanes in the front line. At 10:30 a.m., radar stations picked up a raid of 250-plus aircraft coming across the channel. As more and more radar stations called in their reports, Fighter Command's plotting rooms soon resembled a crazy gambling table in Las Vegas, as counters and markers tracked the advancing attack. Immediately, RAF Command put up its fighters to meet them. More formations of aircraft were picked up. Fighter Command now realized that this could be the big one and ordered 3 more air bases to scramble their fighters. As radar tracked the enemy, they knew the target was London. More squadrons were scrambled and hurled against the Germans. There were now 15 squadrons of fighters battling against the Luftwaffe. Winston Churchill, who was visiting RAF Fighter Command HQ, asked, "Where are your reserves?" He was told, "Sir, there are none."
In his account after the war, Churchill says, "The odds were great, the margins small, the stakes infinite."
Just after midday, those Luftwaffe bombers that managed to get through and bomb London began to fight their way back to their base. It had been a bloody battle. But more was to come. At 2:30 in the afternoon, radar picked up 300 bombers in 2 waves, heavily escorted by fighters. Again, the RAF was ready for them. It continued to maneuver around the German fighters and bombers, bringing them down.
I did 4 sorties and shot down 2 aircraft. It was all go, if you like, because they seemed to just keep coming, and you'd get scrambled, you'd get involved, back to base, rearm, refuel, another scramble, and so it went on.
By dusk, the last of the Luftwaffe had returned to their bases. The German pilots were horrified by the number of British fighters that had attacked them. They had 56 aircrafts shot out of the sky, 81 aircrew killed, with 94 either wounded or taken prisoner. For the Germans, it was the end of the line. The Luftwaffe would never have mastery over the skies of Great Britain.
And September the 15th made them realize that after spending 4 weeks trying to destroy Fighter Command, they were getting absolutely nowhere. They were back to square one. It appeared to be, and was in fact, stronger than ever before. And they did the only thing a rational man can do: they gave up.
The figures make chilling reading. The RAF lost over 1,100 aircraft, with 500 men killed. The Luftwaffe, 1,700 planes, with 3,368 airmen killed or taken prisoner. But even after the slaughter of September the 15th, Goering was still boasting that he could destroy Britain in 4 days. Hitler ignored him. He quietly cancelled plans for an invasion of Britain. Instead, he started planning for his invasion of the Soviet Union in the following year. But the bombing of Britain's cities continued throughout the long winter of 1940 and 41, only this time it was at night. London was attacked with only a single night's respite for 76 consecutive nights. Almost 30,000 civilians were killed and 250,000 made homeless. They became the frontline troops and bore the brunt of the conflict. But the Battle of Britain was not a conventional battle with a clear winner and loser. Both sides could claim some level of victory. But for Churchill's few, the legacy of those who did not survive will remain forever.
They deserve all respect you can give them. That I'm sure of.
Hitler and Goering had committed a huge blunder by not gaining mastery of the skies. By leaving Britain undefeated, they left a nation able to provide the rallying cry for freedom.
The Battle of Britain was the beginning of the strategic defeat of the Germans as they charge off into the Soviet Union without the resources they need in order to win.
They're outside the military chain of command, so they can investigate their way. The latest NCIS mission comes to an explosive conclusion next this Wednesday night, here on 5.